Gavin Ray, który jest żywym dowodem na to, że nie tylko Polacy emigrują do Wielkiej Brytanii, ale również Brytyjczycy imigrują do nas. Czyli dr Gavin Ray z Polski, z Warszawy, z Katedry Nauk Społecznych Akademii Koźmińskiego. Zajmuje się transformacją polskiej gospodarki po 1989 roku, ze szczególnym uwzględnieniem demontażu systemu opieki społecznej w Polsce.
Okay, thank you. We organised this conference to mark 25 years since the end of what was called communism, which of course happened in 1989. 1989 was a turning point in world history. Events which started in this year signified a change of such proportions that they not only radically transformed the economic, political and social situation in Central Eastern Europe itself, but they also radically transformed the rest of the world. The transformations in Central Eastern Europe we can describe as being systemic revolutions. This means that they were not just political transformations, but they changed entirely a complete social and economic system that was dominant in the region for around half a century. They turned back the course of history, which many had predicted would proceed from capitalism towards some form of socialism. Even those who had been in opposition to the state socialist systems hoped that they would be able to change them or transform them or overthrow them in order to create some form of more democratic and humane socialism. So therefore, in 1989, capitalism was in a sense reborn. It was given a new sense of, a new lease of life, as vast areas of the world were once again open to commodification, and for the first time in history, a real, true, global, capitalist economic system was created. 1989 was also a period of great optimism and hopes, and brought with it its own ideologies. It's probably been forgotten by many, and perhaps we should return to it, as most people in this room would share in some ways the ideals of the left. But the left almost unanimously welcomed the changes in 1989, not just because they were overthrowing an authoritarian system which had run its course, but also with the belief that they were going to lead to progressive change in Europe and the world. It's long been forgotten, but most of the intellectuals and movements in the left, in Western Europe, and those that exist in Eastern Europe, believed that we were entering a period where there would be a united socialist or social democratic Europe which would stretch from Lisbon to Moscow. Unfortunately, these hopes did not come true. What quickly happened was that the ideology of 1989 became one of liberalism, which of course, has been mentioned already, was most famously summarized in the ill-fated dictum of Fukuyama, the so-called end of history. The accepted narrative of this time was that the failures of the command economies in Eastern Europe had proved the superiority of free market capitalism. And therefore, the twin freedoms of political democracy and a market economy were now seen as being inseparable. One could not exist without the other. They were dependent upon one another. After time, of course, the majority of the left, or large parts of the centre-left, came to accept these wisdoms, as they moved away not just from the principles of socialism, but also from the principles and ideals of social democracy and welfare capitalism. This, of course, was most famously summarized in the theory of the Third Way, which was propagated by Tony Blair and his ideologue Anthony Giddens, which unfortunately arose out of the social democratic movement in my own country. The purpose of this talk is to look at the ideology of liberalism in 1989, the so-called end of history. And I want to take it at face value. What were the hypotheses of this time? What did people think would happen in the world in the 25 years, in the course of a century ahead of them? And we can summarize this into four main areas. Firstly, they believed that market economies and political democracies would spread around the world and would establish themselves. And as I said, these were synonymous with one another, and this was the end point of history, and this was the model which would be repeated throughout the globe. Secondly is that the free market would bring continual and stable growth. And it would bring a rise in living standards and wealth to all those introduced free market economies. Alongside this, the free market would allow for to be development of free civil societies, which would be the bedrocks of the liberal democratic system. And from these civil societies, a political system would emerge of liberal democracy, where politics would gravitate towards the centre, the so-called radical centre, as Anthony Giddens described it. And therefore, the extremes of the left and the right would be overshadowed, and a new centre of politics would form. And finally, we were to be entering a period of global peace and stability after the end of the Cold War. So let's take this. What has actually happened over the past 25 years? Well, the market economy has indeed successfully expanded. We now live within globalized capitalist economy. The word globalization was hardly used before 1989. If we look in Central Eastern Europe, the transition to capitalism in Central Eastern Europe did not result in the expected growth in living standards. A study carried out last year in all of the countries of the region, which was published in the journal Lancet, revealed that the mass privatization of these economies came at a huge human cost, with the number of deaths increasing by 13% in the first 10 years of the transition. In other words, around 1 million people died in Central Eastern Europe due to the shock therapy reforms. The most important reason for this loss of life was the 56% increase in unemployment and the collapse in health and social care systems that had been created previously. The largest economic collapses were, of course, felt in the poorer countries to the east of the region that had once belonged to the former Soviet Union. These countries underwent the greatest peacetime economic collapses of history, as public wealth passed over to a small and corrupt elite. For example, in Russia during Boris Yeltsin's presidency, which was supported and backed by the West, often in violent means, GDP declined by more than 52%. In Ukraine, GDP per capita is still today 20% below what it had been at the end of communism, and GDP per capita is continuing to decline in this country. In contrast to these failures, the countries in the west of the region, such as Poland, have been presented as the success stories of the transition. Their initial economic declines were harsh, but less so than in the nations to the east. Their economies began to recover earlier as they became integrated into the economic, military and political institutions of the West, such as the European Union and NATO, and their political democracies began to stabilize. It would of course be foolish to dismiss many of the gains which have occurred in these countries. I mean, anybody who walks around Warsaw today will see that there has been huge advances for many areas in social and cultural life. However, we can also not ignore that these countries tend to possess huge social inequalities, mass employment, unemployment, large areas of poverty, disintegrating social and health systems, etc. The other fact of the economic impact of the transition was that it changed capitalism in the West itself. And this happened in a number of ways. Firstly, capitalism was able to expand from Western Europe and in the West in general, to expand into Central Eastern Europe, take advantage of the resources, the cheap labour which existed there, and of course exploit the opportunities to sell its goods. Also what it meant is that a new form of neoliberal capitalism could arise in Western Europe. And Catherine was mentioning 2 dates, and I agree with the extent that the neoliberal form of capitalism began to rise in the 1970s due to the crisis of the electric profit and so forth, and the need to attempt to increase the rate of exploitation. But this was given a boost by 1989 and the transformation in Eastern Europe. The welfare state in Western Europe was created in the conditions of the post-war period when the alternative, however inadequate this alternative was, an alternative in the world economy existed in Eastern Europe. It's slightly ironic actually, perhaps those who were most supportive or benefited the most from communism in Eastern Europe are often the populations in Western Europe who were able to take advantage of part of the fear of its own capitalist classes as they were provided with welfare benefits and so forth. A counter movement, a counterweight to the world capitalist system was removed in 1989. This meant that you had this unleashed market forces and created a more confident and powerful form of capitalism. This has widened social inequalities, concentrated economic wealth, increased the power of finance and banking system, and ultimately ended up in a financial crisis of 2008, from which the world has yet to recover, and where we're standing now in a period of crisis. So therefore, the free market economy has not created the wealth and rising living standards that we were promised in 1989. In fact, if we look in Central Eastern Europe, recovery only began in most countries once the state began to regain some control over its economy and restrict the forces of the free market. In many cases, this was done in an authoritarian and corrupt way, creating or helping to establish the oligarchical form of capitalism. However, even in success cases like Poland, growth only began in the early to mid-90s, once the economic reforms were slowed down. Or later, when new sources of public investment flowed into the country after joining the European Union. Although the image of Poland as the green island in Europe is in many ways a myth, the growth it's enjoyed over the last 10 years is in many ways an example of how redistributing public funds within the European Union and using them to drive public investment can bring positive results. The economic failures in Central Eastern Europe have meant that in many countries the democratic systems have been undermined and now exist in all but name. The economic and social collapse undermined democracy and the growth of civil society. And this is not just in the eastern countries, but also in many of the new European Union countries, most notably at the moment in Hungary. The idea that the market economy helps to stabilize democracy has been proved to be untrue. Political systems in Eastern Europe tend to have low participation rates in elections and very low memberships of political parties. I'm not sure of anybody here people who have come from outside of Poland have been following the scandal in the local elections which occurred last Sunday. We still don't have the results from these elections. But what this has shown is actually the neoliberal state in Poland cannot even organize itself sufficiently enough to run an efficient election, as it's been caught up in the culture of bidding and the race to the bottom, even at the level of electoral politics. Its civil society has not even developed enough to understand the procedures of voting, but this disorganized state has attempted to organize. The neoliberal model has removed social protections, eroded the basis for political democracy, and the development of a healthy civil society. And therefore, we are not seeing the growth of a radical, liberal centre. What we are seeing is the move towards extremes. Partly, unfortunately, a minority, we see some development of left alternatives, but the most of its radicalism in Europe, in Western Europe, and in Eastern Europe, is the rise of authoritarianism and the rise of the far right. And finally, the last hypothesis of 1989 was that we were meant to be entering an era of global peace and stability. We are in fact living now in an extremely dangerous world where wars and conflicts have become the norm. Almost immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we saw the outbreak of the conflict in the Middle East. And ever since, we've seen a range of conflicts from countries such as Yugoslavia. We should remember that the bombing of Yugoslavia happened within 2 weeks after the expansion of NATO into Poland, Hungary, Czech, and Slovakia. We have seen wars from Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, 3 times I think there's been wars in Iraq, Libya, etc. As we gather in Poland today, next door in Ukraine, a war continues to rage that has always has already seen an estimated 3,000 people be killed. We may hold different opinions on the causes and reasons of this conflict, but Ukraine is an example of the failure of the transition, and of the terrible effects that economic collapse can have on a country. This conference, therefore, has not been envisioned as another anniversary conference. We've had many of these in Warsaw. These are events which are the propaganda of success. This is not one to discuss the failures even of the previous system, or to discuss whether the transition could have occurred in a slightly different way, although these issues may arise within the discussions. This is more an opportunity to take stock and to share experiences and perceptions of where we are now in Central Europe, in a world that is drastically different from what it was 25 years ago. History, unfortunately, did not end in 1989. The utopian vision of a peaceful, prosperous capitalism did not come to pass. We face old and new challenges that need to be faced without being restrained by the complexes of past failures. I hope that today's conference will be an opportunity to discuss this.
Hello, my name is Agata Czarnacka. I'm an editor-in-chief of a journal, opinion journal, Legislative.pl in Polish. And referring to what Gavin said about last Sunday's elections, I would like to invite you to come for, say, a kind of a political meeting that suddenly forms. Oh no, it's not a political meeting. No, we'd like to discuss how theoretical models of democracy can be applied in those quite hard times of today for Polish democracy. It would be tomorrow, and I would like you to think about application of your knowledge and practices to what is happening nowadays in Poland. It's tomorrow, room 207 in this building, 11:15. Thank you.
So my name is Lukáš Matuška. I don't want to disturb you very long because I think there is another papers and we are running out of time. But I have a very short comment to the first paper or speech, a contribution of Luboš Blaha. You have distinguished at the beginning of your speech between those who win in the world of global capitalism and those who of course lose or are defeated. And you've mentioned sarcastically that when today those who lose could be localized in the third world, we're still waiting for something like that in such a level in Europe. I just want to say that I think that such places of those who lose, of course, can be found in Europe nowadays, and this hasn't been mentioned in your lecture. I think that these places are, for instance, in Slovakia or in Czech Republic, of course, ghettos, mainly Romani ghettos of socially excluded people. And if you compare the living standards of these people with the usual living standard in the third world country, there is no difference. So these places really may be called the islands of the third world. So this is my sarcastic comment. We are no longer waiting for anything. We already have the third world places in European countries, and it is a pity that you didn't comment on more on Slovakian politics, because it would really interest me whether in your party, in Smer, in the Social Democratic Party of Slovakia, there is any opposition towards a clear racist anti-Ziganism of Smer leadership presented by the Prime Minister Fico.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, my name is Stephanie. I come from Germany. I was born in East Berlin, and I started as a person from East Germany, and I became, after reunification, a West German person. So maybe my comment is also due to that. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very glad to speak about experiences from '89. And I liked very much all interventions of you, really, because I think these are topics we need to discuss more. I want to make only one point concerning this East and West thing, which is that even though we do have to speak about specific situations in Slovenia, in Eastern Europe, in Poland, I think what is needed too is to develop categories and perspectives linking East and West, because East and West in Europe is linked, and East and West and South. I want to give two examples. Catherine spoke about, and this is a very important thing, Catherine spoke about the fact that Eastern Europe is and became very early a kind of experimental field for transnational corporations, for austerity politics. This is true, and it's not enough known in the whole debate in the West, but today's experimental field is Greece and Spain. So this idea to take what we call periphery as a pioneer to implement measurements is something which does not only take place within Eastern Europe, but now takes place concerning Spain and Greece and Italy and so on. The second example is, Gavin spoke about the, we call it post-democracy development. You know, this more authoritarian politic kind of style. In Germany today, right today, we have a whole debate and a whole campaign to change labor law, to make strikes more difficult. And so it is not, and I could speak about fragmentation, exclusion in Germany too. So we have to link, this is my point, we have to link and to develop categories to have the whole issue in it with specific situations in the South, in the East, in the West, but they are linked to each other, and we have to go more on that too.
Hi, Joachim Becker from Vienna. I would say that one of the core categories would be core and periphery, or peripheries, and possibly not even one core, but I mean between Germany and the UK, the position in the European division of labour is quite different. And I would say the same applies to the different type of economic peripheries. And Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary or Slovenia, still partially industrialized, very export orientated, but Southeastern Europe or the Baltic countries, there was mainly financialization, and now financialization is more or less over, and so far I would say that there are important differences in the type of integration into the European economy, and with different mechanisms and different social structures as well. Whether there is still something like an industrial workforce, but does have existed, I would say that makes a difference. And in regard to the austerity policies, which already have been mentioned, I mean, first it was Latin America, then the Latin American model was applied in I would say particularly in Latvia. In Latvia, for me, that's the model for Greece and other South European countries. And politically, I would say there is an internal periphery and a semi-internal periphery, but now would be Ukraine or Moldavia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina being a protectorate, I mean, that was a special type of periphery, and this does impact on the conditions of political activity as well, I would say. And it implies a certain type of integration and fragmentation.
Thank you very much for the questions, and I will try to be very brief. As regards Lukáš, Matuška, thank you very much for the question, and of course there are losers also in Central Europe. I'm sure that many of our friends are also the losers, many people who are unemployed, many people who are with social benefits, who are really really unidentified and who are really in bad positions. And the worst things are really the slums, the Roma ghettos, the Roma slums, Slovakia, Czech Republic. I don't know how it is in Poland, but there are many slums also in Hungary. But still, this is the situation of kind of maybe not a minority of people, but not so big majority like in, for example, Honduras or on the Central America. So it's only the difference between the semi-periphery and periphery. Yes, it's about this. And yeah, maybe we need the different political strategies for semi-periphery, for periphery, and for the center. It's a difference, and sometimes it's very hard to explain, for example, to people in Honduras that the biggest or the most important political issue for you is the same like the biggest political issue for the people from Munich or from Bonn or from Berlin. So there are differences, and this was my story about. But I fully understand and fully agree with you that there are people in ghettos and in that situation also in Slovakia and Central Europe, catastrophic situation very comparable with this Honduras and I don't know, Bolivia and so on. But still, in Bolivia, I know Bolivia, for example, still that the people in poverty is like 80%. In the real poverty, it's not the poverty, relative poverty, it's absolute poverty, I mean. And in Slovakia, it's still, in relative poverty, it's 25%, and it's in absolute poverty, it's about 5%. People, it's a difference. I don't like it, but it is a difference. And as regards the anti-Tsiganism or anti-Roma attitudes, it is a problem. It is a problem in Slovakia, it is a problem in general. I will not tell you that in Smer social democracy it's better. It's present in whole Slovak society. This anti-Tsiganism, it's cultural trend, and I think that in Smer social democracy there are a few people who are opposed to this trend, but I will not tell you that it is like much better than in other parties. It's a sad story, really. I was opposed to these actions against Roma as regards to social benefits, which are now dependent on the activity. Before it was universal, and without any activity, work activity. So it was not very easy for me as well, but it only mirrored the mood in the society, and it was only political step which mirrored the moods in society. And again, this is the trend of global capitalism. Okay, the problems of Romas are structural, are economical and structural. No, they cannot find work because they are Romas. So this is a real problem, and this is the vicious cycle. But yes, you are true that we can agree on that the causes are structural, but the consequences are very real for people who are the neighbors of Romas and so on, because they are stealing them the goods and so on. So the mood and the atmosphere is bad towards Roma. And I can't solve it like this. We must find some solutions, and I am trying to make some cultural work also within the Social Democratic Party, but it's not so easy. And that's why I think that it's not about racism. It's not a kind of scientific racism, of kind of Hitlerism or some kind. It's kind of cultural racism, which is very dangerous, yes it is. It will be worse and worse because of these structural economic problems. But this problem cannot be solved only on the table of culture. It must be solved on the table of economy, and that's why I was trying to talk about this economic structure. Thank you.
Yes, I want to make 3 rapid comments. First, on that last issue, to say that in France too, and so it's a general problem, the question of racism and xenophobia. Even on the topics that I raised, that is commons, that is the question of social gains and social services. Even some people of the front, national front in France, but that would be the same in Greece, for instance, with Aube Dorée, with the far right. They would claim that social service be only for good French, real French, or good Greek citizen, and so on. So this is a key difference of our reference to the question of racism, and it's very important. Second remark, even if they are, on the question of inequalities and the third world in the center of the capitalist system, not only in Slovakia, it's more broader problem, I would say, using Piketty, Thomas Piketty book on the general trends of inequality in the capitalism, in the capital of the 21st century, going towards the inequalities that were dominating the capitalism and the core countries in the 19th century. And this for US and for France and for the trends in all core countries, which is very important. That is the fact that even if, of course, you compare absolute level of life and so on, you have difference with Latin America, but if you look at the trend of evolution of it's the destruction in the very core countries of the reduction of inequalities and of social gains, because, like it was said by Gavin, there was a capitalism which was under the pressure of internal and external threat of communism, of alternative, which is no more the case. So that is very important. And last point, the combination of the comment of the two intervention from the comments from Germany and Austria. Yes, there is very big differences and specificities, and even a combination of what you said, the fragmentations, a different way of being integrated in the capitalist system. But we have to put emphasis on the element of unity. And I had, in fact, no time to concretize that point. And I do believe that if you take, that's why my point on commons is made, that is, if you take health, education, the control of the return, the question of water to everyone against privatization, and democratic rights, the subordination of economy and of money or finance to ecological and social rights, and you have a unifying field of rights. And we should have, like in Spain, for instance, they have organized mass movement with colors, waves, the green, white, and so on, green movements on the question of health, and then on education. We should have very spectacular, similar movements at the European level on the question of health. The resistance in all countries against privatization, and I have no time to quote also student struggles in Croatia and even now in Serbia against commodification of education, health, and so on. It's for a new generation of questions.
I'd just like to make a comment on this East-West thing, and maybe today I'll do it from the Western perspective. That's very interesting. If we look at the last 25 years, 1989, everybody got excited. Everybody was, this is wonderful, this is the opening of democracy, civil society, everything's going to be lovely. And then the West forgot. And really, for 10, 15 years, nobody has really talked about Eastern Europe. I mean, apart from, going on cheap flights to Krakow and getting, British stag parties getting drunk, or, stupid Americans wanting to be Kafka in Prague or something like this. There was almost nothing was said about Eastern Europe. But then suddenly, as if from nowhere, it came back and started biting people. Suddenly, from nowhere, you started getting millions of immigrants appearing on the shores of Britain, taking our jobs and doing God knows what else. And for example, the Polish plumber in France was put up. This was the the cultural expression of a division of labour which had been created from 1989. And it was like suddenly this had come from nowhere. How did this happen? And so then, of course, what do you lead to? Getting people voting for UKIP and Nigel Farage and all of this stuff, and the Eastern Europeans become the demons alongside the Muslims. And then suddenly there's wars. Where did this come from? How did this happen? Suddenly. And there's a paradox. I mean, you look at Ukraine, for example, the attitude to the West Ukraine is a total paradox. On the one hand, they're like, fly the EU flags, go on, go on, go on, do it, revolution. We will welcome you, although if you try and come to our country, we don't want this. So there's this on the one hand, and then at the same time, so we're saying, do it, come on, come into the EU, expanded EU, and at the same time we're saying, but what people who are already here, could they go away, please? And could they stop taking our jobs? And do we have to move our factories to Łódź or something like this? So the paradox of the East and West, from a Western perspective, has been built upon this periphery in the core. And I think actually what's happening now is that Eastern Europe is coming back into people's consciousness. It's coming back from 10, 15 years where nobody talked about it. People are beginning to talk about it again, because the effects of a transition, which everybody cheered and then forgot, is coming back in many different ways.
Now it's a kind of challenge to speak about Ukrainian identity, but I will do, I don't know, maybe the easier way or maybe the more difficult. I will speak how Ukrainian identity during Euromaidan, during this period, was perceived in Polish opinion journalism. It's part of my scholarly interest because I'm interested in identity, in Ukrainian identity, and also in how it is reflected in public media discourse. So what I want to do. During this presentation, I will do the brief analysis of main identity issues in contemporary Ukraine, what are the main problems which are discussed in scholarly literature, then I will explain why I chose Polish opinion journalism, and on the examples of three Polish opinion ubiquitous news magazines, Polityka, Prost and Newsweek Polska. I will show some results of my analysis. The first one, during the years of independence, identity in post-Soviet Ukraine still suffered from different inferiority complexes and uncertainty. New social and political transformation in Central Europe brought new challenges for countries and also for Ukraine, and its way to democracy and civic society. So, Euromaidan in Ukraine, I argue that it was a kind of point of deprecation in forming the identity of Ukraine, and it is supposed to be like during these few months the new Ukrainian identity was constructed. I follow this theory that identity is construct. Like Ernest Gellner said that people are not born with identities; they acquire them through this process of socialization, politicization, and so on. But it's very important to see how identity is perceived also by external actors. And so during the social and political changes in Ukraine, Ukrainian identity was followed by different reflection in media, in the country and also abroad. Like in Ukrainian scholarly literature, there are plenty of materials about the discussions about different types of Ukrainian identity and different divisions and distinctions among it. But the most, how to say it, the most popular and I distinct it as the defining components of national identity in Ukraine, there are ethnic and civic components, and they are in some kind of rivalry and what had to be given priority. Due to post-communist, post-colonial legacy, let's say the majority of the population in post-Soviet states, including Ukraine, link their national identity with supranational. Because it was a kind of difficult task to re-establish the national self and redefine who is the other. And that's why the population in post-Soviet states needed to have some kind of supranational identity. Here, what are like main types of identity in Ukraine, which are explained in scholarly literature? Here I use the expression identity complexes. It was introduced by Stefan Schulman. He conducted research on identity in different regions of Ukraine, and he defines like two identity complexes in Ukraine: the ethnic Ukrainians and Eastern Slavic Ukrainians. Yes, it could be discussed. So when we read about who are ethnic Ukrainians, say I described like more European, with and this identity is rather considered like civic, but with strong cultural and ethnic features. The second one is identity complex is Eastern Slavic identity. It was described also by Ukrainian scholar Mykola Repchuk, like it's some kind of Creole identity with a complex inferiority complex called Little Russianism, and it's based on the idea of common origins of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and it's characterized by uncertainty in considering of ethnic identity. Yes, as we can see here, it's internal identity, and as we are talking about ethnic Ukrainians, there are supranational identity, it's a tendency to Europe, and Eastern Slavic identity is concentrated on one Eastern Slavic word. Then it was like my theoretical framework. Using it, I did my content analysis in Polish opinion journalism and tried to compose some image of Ukrainian identity, how it was reflected in Polish opinion journalism. So, what Polish opinion journalism exactly is? In Poland, it's called like prasa opinii, and it's rather not opinion journalism in its classical understanding as editorial articles, sometimes on blogs, and when the journalists write their point of view, it's rather opinion-making journalism. It is characterized by opinion-making editorial staff, orientation of the periodicals on social, political, and cultural problems, and also a specific literary publicistic style. Like opinion press in Poland it is divided in social-cultural press and social-political press. But with time, social-cultural press have lost its position in Polish media market, and the most popular are social-political newspapers, magazines, and so on. I will, for this presentation, I concentrated my attention on the Polish opinion-making weeklies, Polityka, Wprost, and Newsweek Polska. They are considered as the most opinion-making weekly magazine, weekly press in Poland, and they hold top position in 7. So let's move to examples what I discovered during my short research. The first case I will talk about, it's a Polish opinion weekly, Polityka. I think that most of you are familiar with it who are living in Poland. It's a Polish liberal leftist influential social political weekly. It is been published in Warsaw since 1977. In general information you can see here. And what was the general image of Ukrainian identity here? I didn't find some heterogeneous image of Ukraine, some one type. And initially I can tell that the two types of Ukrainian identity were displayed, were demonstrated by journalists of Polityka, like Ukrainians as Europeans and Ukrainians as radical nationalists. During Maidan, I don't want you to forget about it. So, the specifics of description Ukrainian identity in Polityka. Journalists, while describing the growing European identity during Euromaidan, they also tried to show the second side, the other side of Ukraine, like Eastern Ukraine. For example, in the first article published in Polityka after the first protest started in Euromaidan, it's called Droga to Europe, the way to Europe. This article was started with the words like Kyiv is the only place in Europe where the flag of European Union has been kissed in this way. But in the same time, journalist emphasizes that we should not remember that it's a quotation that not all Ukrainians supported and support integration with Europe, that East economically and mentally is closer to Russia. Another, very often, and it's naturally, like it was predictable, that Euromaidan was compared to Orange Revolution. But still, indeed, journalists saw the distinction between Euromaidan and Orange Revolution, and this distinction was exactly in identity of people participating on these two both sides, let's say, for this movement. And journalists write that Euromaidan was kind of party one, kind of more political, but not Euromaidan, Orange Revolution, and Euromaidan it's Ukrainian, it's like blue and yellow, and this was described by Polish by journalist Igenka Winczak. Also, what I noticed that very often Ukrainian movement during Euromaidan was compared to the solidarity movement, and there we could find some motives of nostalgia and some kind of these feelings. But also, I met quite a lot of articles describing, like they say, crisis of Ukrainian identity during Euromaidan, which were embodied in the race, like nationalistic motifs, nationalistic some symbols, words, and so on. And for example, words glory to Ukraine and red and black flags were called fascist and incompatible with Europe, and journalists, like they were very disappointed of writing it, how in Ukraine, in Euromaidan, striking for Europe, it could be allowed. But still, like as I said, it was not like some editorial policy that we will display this image of Ukraine or this or this. In the same time, I could find articles which refuted this general image of Ukrainian nationalists as radical, fascist, and so on. And for example, there was one article. Journalists tried to explain that Ukrainian nationalism and those radical, for example, existing movements in Ukraine Ukraine, it's not the same what was happened during Euromaidan, and it was kind of explanation that Euromaidan was not organized by nationalists and fascists. Also, what was very interesting for me, reading some series of reports from Euromaidan. Euromaidan was presented as Zaporizhian siege, Ukrainian Cossack state, a symbol of freedom and struggle for independence. It was presented by Polish journalists, and so this Ukrainian identity was presented as ethnic one and striving for freedom and democracy. Let's move to the second opinion weekly magazine. It's Pert. Pert is Polish centrist weekly news magazine. It is also quite old. It was realized. The first edition was realized in 1982. Here also you can see the general information about it, but in comparison to Politica, I couldn't find in every issue some analytical articles about Ukraine, what was happened and what was happening in the Euromaidan. And the image of Ukrainian identity was presented more holistic. There were no different representations of Ukrainians. These Ukrainians were represented with strong supranational identity, with European strong supranational identity, and with civic national identity. Specifics, but because it's very simple information, explanation about it, because more reports about events on Euromaidan were written mainly by Ukrainian journalists. As I said, that Ukrainians were represented with strong European supranational identity, and also even Ukrainian journalists were writing for Polish readers. They describing describing people participating in Euromaidan. They showed that these people didn't have awareness about what Europe really is. And this Europe was inscribed in Ukrainian identity frame as some kind of idealistic concept. And for me, it gives some connotations with these intellectual discussions, which was in 1980s in East Central Europe, when it was started by Milan Kundera, and this concept of Europe, it's Europe of ideas, of values, and so on, and not some kind of political or economic structure. Also, in Pert, I haven't found mentions about some radical nationalists or controversial image of Ukrainian identity. There were kind of reports about cultural Euromaidan when Ukrainian singers, artists, poets, writers explained that these Ukrainian nationalists that they are not the main players of Euromaidan, and they shouldn't be taken into consideration. So the third one, it's a Newsweek Polska. It's kind of new on Polish media market, and also Prost. Ukraine during Euromaidan was presented with strong civic national identity and with fully expressed European identities. There were no some kind of reports about Eastern Ukraine, which doesn't share the values of Euromaidan. But still, I found that nationalistic identity was presented, but it was presented in very soft, objective way, without just juxtaposition to Europeans. But still, these words like Hungarians, radical nationalists were used. But in Newsweek Polska, I met the expression "New Ukraine." Like the journalists acknowledged that during this process, some kind of new society, new identity in Ukraine was born. For example, here you can see in Polish, it's article entitled like Banderowiec też czyta Mickiewicza. It's like Banderian also read Mickiewicz, and journalists wanted to find some kind of reconciliation between these two types of identity perceived in Poland society and also in Polish media. So here, I will conclude that during Euromaidan, Ukrainian identity was perceived in two vectors. Like Ukrainians as European citizens with high awareness of their rights and responsibilities, conscious of democratic roots and principles with strong civic identity. But also this stereotypical for Polish society, radical nationalist Hungarian, which is incompatible with European democratic and liberal world, was presented as well, but in last month. So that's it.